Stay hungry, stay foolish.
Today's book is a classic. It has changed our understanding of metaphor and its role in language and the mind. Metaphor, our guest explains, is a fundamental mechanism of mind, one that allows us to use what we know about our physical and social experience to provide understanding of countless other subjects. Because such metaphors structure our most basic understandings of our experience, they are, as he says, metaphors we live by. Metaphors that shape our perceptions and actions without our ever noticing them. It is an immense honour and a real treat to welcome the author of a plethora of titles, but the focus of today's show is his 1981 book, Metaphors We Live By, George Lakoff. George, welcome to the show.
What a pleasure to be here, Aidan.
It is so good to have you. I've had a Lakoff experience. I was telling you, I was down so many rabbit holes, excuse the metaphor, exploring so many of the thoughts. Neurons were firing all over my brain, and it was just such a pleasure. I'm going to jump all over the place. I'm going to use as much as I can, stick to the journey metaphor and stick to the road, but I will jump all over the place. And before we even get into metaphors, George, I thought it was important to discuss some of your work on how the brain does language and thought. Your work resides at the intersections of cognitive linguistics, neuroscience, and experimental psychology, and you live at the intersections, which is a maxim of innovation. I'd love to share your origin story, where you came from, how you got into all this work, and all the dots that have connected in between.
Where I came from. Well, I was born in New Jersey, a little town named Bayonne, New Jersey. My parents had never made it to high school. Both very, very smart people who had to go to work when they were 12 and 13. And, they insisted that I get an education, which I then did. I have an older brother by 10 years, Sandy Lakoff, who became professor at major universities. He taught at Harvard and at UC San Diego and so on. Started the political science department at UC San Diego. And he's been an inspiration, 10 years older and done great work in political science. So I, have a good model. And it's interesting when you have parents who never made it to high school and were super smart. And they said, you're going to get an education, whatever happens. My mother said, you're going to college, whatever that is. And she never understood it. And, it was really almost funny. My first job was teaching at Harvard. And my mother didn't know what Harvard was, had no idea. But the first day I was teaching, I got a call from my mother, right? And she was last in grade school in 1911, if you can believe this, right? And she asked, well, how did it go? I said, fine. She said, the kids, did they behave? I said, well, some smart Alex, but just fine. She said, and how did the principal sit in on your class, right? It had no conception of this. My wonderful mother, very, very brilliant woman who never had a chance to go to high school. It's really something to be able to, my mother insisted that I learn things. She taught me arithmetic when I was 3. When I was 4, she put me to work, doing arithmetic in daily life, namely at that point, when she went shopping, was before they had cash registers. And they wrote things down on bags and added them up. And my job was to check the addition to be sure she wasn't being cheated.
Fantastic.
At the age of 4, it's, it was a wonderful thing for her to do. I mean, to make sure that I was going to get educated if she wasn't. My father was a brilliant man who wound up taking a night school course in accounting and working for the general accounting office, and uncovering scandals in the in the government. Um, and he was also a terrific writer. And when he died, my brother, who was old, 10 years older, wrote an obituary for him, and on a lark sent it to the New York Times. And they wrote back asking for his picture. And they said he was their favorite letter writer. We never know. We didn't know. But, I had a wonderful father, and, he did all sorts of good things in the world.
That's such a beautiful legacy to have, and for you to remember him so fondly, and your mother.
Yeah. And my brother is 10 years older, and, he became a professor, first at Harvard, now at UC San Diego. Now he's retired. But he was an inspiration, terrific political scientist. And, I've been fortunate.
Amazing. I'll come back to then how you progressed, because you have so many different disciplines in your background, mathematics, arts, etc., where arts meet maths, and all the great neurons that fired from there. But there's something you said there that really jumped at me, which was when you mentioned about your mother teaching arithmetic when you were only 3, because you tell us that the human brain has 100 billion neurons, and that we lose most of those by the time we're 5. And I thought this was interesting because of the importance of that early intervention, and the importance of the love that your mother showed you for education, and the seeds that she planted there are so vital in this age where many adults are just unaware of that impact that it has on children. Also, one of the many bits of research I did, you mentioned in 2013 there was an NYT article, New York Times article, about African American children and how they were severely impacted by the lack of education in their younger age.
I grew up originally when my parents were poor, and we lived in a tenement apartment house that was not terribly upscale, and it was next to an African American apartment house. And on the street, we all played together. My friends were African American, half of them, and on the street, we were just friends. There was no issue of racism. There was just nothing, and that was a wonderful thing to happen. They're perfectly, the people there who were next door were perfectly smart, interesting people. One of them, my best friend, Anthony, wound up, he was very good at track, and wound up going to Arizona State University on a track scholarship. But, the issue was not whether he was smart. He was smart. No question about that. The question was, is he going to get educated? And how is he going to get educated? Luckily, he got a track scholarship and went to college. I haven't seen him since, but, I'm sure he's doing fine. You learn about people very early when you're in close contact, and you realize that, they're all just people.
George, about the neurons and the connections of those neurons and the stimulation of those before the age of 5, I thought that was fascinating and so important for those people listening who have an influence over children, that the care and the time they give to children in those early days have such a massive impact on their futures.
It's all true. And I actually was a single parent for many years. I got divorced, and my wife at the time, my first wife, didn't know how to deal with children. So I became both mother and father. And so I raised our son, who is now professor at USC, went into the family business. But it was wonderful to to be a parent from the age of 4 all the way up through high school. I mean, just I loved it. There's parents matter, which is a big deal. Who your parents are and how they, raise you is very important. And I don't think parenting is given as much credit as it needs to be.
Yeah, it's such a huge point, and I know it's difficult for some people. They feel they need to work and they can't afford to be at home. But I just really took that from your work, the importance of the interest that's shown by a parent in the child's learning. But I wanted to dig into this a little bit deeper. Excuse the container metaphor there.
Sure, that's right. Excuse, joy.
Yeah, I just think in metaphors. So your book was such a joy to read. Let's share your wonderful work on how a child creates metaphorical thought at such a young age, because this will make sense to people where they can see that it's this frames that we build over time that becomes the lenses through which we experience the world, and then the lenses through which we enjoy life or not, as the case may be.
It's a matter of the neural system. I mean, what is a metaphor? A metaphor is a set of neural connections across parts of the brain that are concerned with different areas of life. That's all it is. That arises very early in your life, happens all the time. You think metaphorically. You can't not think metaphorically. The simple thing, prices rose. They didn't go up there, And more is some metaphor, more is up. You use it all the time. And there are other, lots of other parts of the metaphor system that you use all the time. You don't notice that you're using them, but they're there, and they're very important. Another part of the conceptual system is framing, the way that you structure things around a structure called a frame. My late colleague, Charles Fillmore, worked out the structure of what he called frame semantics. And I took it after he died and started applying it to politics. So there's a book called Don't Think of an Elephant, Know Your Values and Frame the Debate that goes into framing in great detail. And it's very important to understand how you're thinking about things, and to notice that our politics is structured around metaphors and frames.
I thought this was fascinating that if I'm a child and I'm observing, so you talk about the subconscious and the conscious brain, and 98% is the subconscious brain, but we're actually building it through observation, what we see, what our parents do, where they bring us, etc. I'd love your thoughts on that, because this, again, massively fascinating work.
It's very important. As I said, parenting is incredibly important. It's very important to give children experiences that can build on that. I lucked out, simply because of necessity in my family. As I said, by the time I was 4, I was checking the edition on the bags, to make sure my mother wasn't being cheated. And when I was 6, I was sent out Sunday mornings to do the Sunday morning shopping. And I, knew the prices of everything. And, I would go down to the stores and I would order such and such, and I'd tell them how much it was going to be before they could tell me, to make sure the 6-year-old wasn't going to get cheated. And the idea of giving children things to do that develop their brains, that are just everyday life things to do. Say, look, this 6-year-old can learn things. This 5-year-old can learn things. And it's a very important thing to see. And I see, my son raising his daughters to be really smart, interesting, amazing people, simply because he takes them seriously. They're creative. They can learn all kinds of things at a young age.
It's interesting. I was telling my kids this. Anytime I interject, I won't say give out as a parent. I make sure they know it's because I care. If I didn't care, I wouldn't say anything. If I didn't care, I wouldn't persevere as they learn something when I can do it 10 times faster. And I think even just a kid understanding that this is an act of love, it may not appear like it, but actually an intervention like that comes from a really good place is really important. But I'll move on, because there was something you said in one of your talks, and I found this so great because I'm fascinated by so many things, how so many things in our unconscious and our environment influence our thinking, and thus shapes our reasoning as well. And I'd love you to share this, because you say how this happens, how the environment shapes our thinking, how it shapes our reasoning, but then how we can actually find out as well. So how we can dig a little bit under the surface to go, what is impacting my reasoning and my thinking?
The idea of looking at your own mind is something a lot of people don't do. I mean, they just, you just think and take it for granted. And it was something that I started doing when I started working with the philosopher Mark Johnson. I was fortunate that he happened to move to Berkeley at a certain period, and happened on his way here. He had been at the University of Chicago and ran into my close friend Jim McCullen there, who gave him my address, and he looked me up when he got here. And he taught me that what philosophy is just the distillation of ordinary life. It's trying to understand what it is to live. And, it's not a highfalutin thing. Now, it turns out to be abstract in many cases because it generalizes over so much. But, we wound up writing a book called Philosophy in the Flesh, where we go and point out that philosophy isn't abstract, that thought isn't abstract, that it's part of your body. Thought is embodied. And, it uses the fact that you have a body and are functioning in the world. And that's something that's not always understood in philosophy. There's an assumption that philosophy is this very, difficult, abstract, Platonic thing. And it's actually an embodied thing. What Mark did was he sort of distilled the metaphors used by philosophers. So in that book, Philosophy in the Flesh, he goes through, in his part, the part that he worked out, the metaphors mostly used by philosophers. And they're everywhere. Philosophy is a metaphorical enterprise. And philosophers think that they're just being rational, abstract, and, not metaphorical at all, and so on, that they're just literal. And they're not. So what Mark did was work out the main metaphors used by philosophers, and they're in that book. And you can go through and you'll see, oh, yes, that's how philosophy is structured. And as a result, and what it says, philosophy is a human enterprise. Those metaphors are the metaphors of everyday life. They're not things that are abstract and, quote, philosophical, unquote. They come out of everyday life.
I really was inspired by that, and it made me think about how many, I'm a collector of quotes of really old, ancient Greek work, etc. And there's a quote and a metaphor essentially by Plutarch: "The mind is not a vessel to be filled, but a fire to be kindled." And it sprung to mind because I wanted to share a piece of absolute gold that you talked about, the idea of the conduit metaphor in teaching, because I thought this was essential for those people who are the audience of this show, people who work in change, people who are parents, teachers, trying to inspire others, maybe with a vision for an organization. Maybe they're going through massive change in those organizations, that this metaphor this conduit metaphor is extremely important. The way you position your language, the way you inspire others, and you're not just telling them, becomes so important to how they learn.
That was worked out by a wonderful scholar named Michael Reddy, who I met, and he taught me a lot about it in the conduit metaphor. He had worked it out in very great detail, and sufficient detail to convince me that other metaphors had to be able to be worked out in that much detail. But he was the brilliant guy who figured that out. And the conduit metaphor is extremely important in terms of understanding not just the way we understand what communication is, but we actually communicate using our understanding of what communication is via that metaphor. That's what he contributed. That's his work, not mine. Very, very, very smart guy.
It's so important. And the thing you do say though is, we'll all have experienced this when somebody maybe is giving a talk or has been asked to come and give a keynote. Usually the speaker will go, well, what's the audience? Where are they, etc. And they're trying to understand what do they already know. And this, and you did teach me this, is so important, because knowing what they already know helps you build upon that. If they don't have a frame already in place, they're going to be lost.
And that's very important, to understand what they know and how it's framed and how it's structured. And the same is true when you go in to teach a class. People in the classroom are not blank slates. They think, they're smart, they're interesting people. And the question is, how do you find out what they know and build on it? Rather than, sort of say they know nothing. That's ridiculous. Your students know lots and lots of stuff, and you are trying to find out what they know and build on it.
You mentioned something there, George, about the embodiment of metaphors or embodiment of emotions. And you tell us about this, the full range of emotions impact our metaphors, and thus they impact how we think, how we actually even express how we think. I'd love you to share this.
I actually have a very long study on anger and the metaphors for anger, the structure of anger. Anger is not just a feeling. It has a conceptual structure. It has a metaphorical structure. It has a logic. There's a logic of anger and so on. And that's true of other quote unquote feelings as well. I mean, feelings are things you feel, which is important, right? Yes, they're embodied. They are emotional things that you feel, but they also have a rational structure. And most people don't understand that their emotions have entailments, things that follow from them, and so on. Emotions are really interesting things that way.
And I'd love to dig in a little bit deeper there, George, about stuff like, what's happening inside the brain when I go to grasp for how do I feel right now, and then actually how it impacts me. So, I'm boiling with anger, etc.
Well, that takes a lot of insight. To understand your own emotions is very difficult, extremely difficult for everybody. And to understand how your emotions impact how you're, talking to people around you, what you're doing, what you're writing, and so on, it really matters. You have to be able to think about it. It's when I was first discovering conceptual metaphor, it happened in an undergraduate seminar in our dining room, oddly enough, at a table that's still there. And one of the undergraduate women in the class came out on a rainy February day, a little bit late, and we noticed that she was crying. And she said that, we tried to discuss some philosophical stuff, and she said, I can't do this right now. I've got a metaphor problem with my boyfriend. And so she looked around and said, maybe you guys can help. And it turned out that, in fact, we did. It was one of those things where, she was having, she and her boyfriend were having difficulties, and they were using different metaphors that were incompatible. And, the class figured that out.
It's wonderful. Let's share that, because you do, and this is beautiful in the book, in Metaphors We Live By. You give all these metaphors, and then you go, look how they play out. For example, love is a journey. So we're stuck, we're at a crossroads, etc. Let's dig into that a little bit deeper.
That was what was there. Her boyfriend had said that the relationship was a dead end street. Well, what does that mean? You can't keep going the way you've been going. You may have to turn back, etc. Right? And she said, well, a woman said, I wanted to go into another dimension. I wanted to be about more than just what it had been about, and so on. And in fact, we sat around the table and with her worked out her understanding of what she wanted out of that. With 6 people around, six very good Berkeley undergraduates, sitting around who are smart people, figuring out what was wrong with her relationship with her boyfriend, and what problems she had by having a limiting a metaphor that limited her understanding.
I wanted to get it back to your background. I said I'd come back there because I thought it was really interesting. All the literature on innovation spells out how important it is that innovation lives at the intersection. So it's almost like a load of colliding Venn diagrams of different disciplines and different thinking, different frames. And you were a walking embodiment of that yourself. So you have been educated in MIT in mathematics, but also arts is hugely important. And I'm saying that for a couple of reasons, because the appreciation of the arts, the appreciation of music, getting beyond the humdrum of everyday life is so important, because it influences how we think, and therefore it influences how we act. And this is vital for innovation and change.
That's true. It's important to think about different disciplines. My wife is an artist, and she thinks in a very different way than I think. And I respect it. She can see things, imagine things that I can't imagine, when she plans a garden, she's, we have a beautiful garden, or other things in the house. She's a painter and can mix colors. So she mixed all the colors of paint in our house. It's beautiful colors all over, the room. You look at the yellow behind. It's not really a yellow; it's an ochre. So, artists can do all kinds of interesting things that non-artists would never think of. And that it's important to be able to think as various artists in different kinds of art, and to respect it as an important part of our life and our society. And it's important also to think in multiple disciplines. There was a point at which I was being interviewed by a group of Chinese scholars, 50 of them, It was quite wonderful because they couldn't understand how I could have written about lots of different fields. They have to go in one field and stay in it. They couldn't understand how you could do mathematics and literature and art and and physics and so on. And I said, that's what the beauty of American education is. You can, and European education. in Ireland too. I mean, you study lots of things and they interact with each other. Your understanding of one field affects your understanding of the next, and that allows for the creation of new understandings. It's not like knowledge stands still.
I love that, and the idea of swimming outside your own swim lane. That whole idea in business before about, oh no, what are you doing, Aidan? That's not your business, and you're kind of going, well, it probably should be. But how did that play out for you? Because I mentioned that maths and arts and literature background, because the arts is so important as a part of education as well. Because so many children, I say children, so many young adults coming out of college are trying to decide what to do. And my piece of advice is always do the arts. Learn to learn to expand your mind, learn to feel what you're interested in. Because don't go, unless you're certain of a discipline you love, try to explore the arts. I'd love your advice there, George.
My feeling is to explore lots of things. What was interesting, I grew up being interested in mathematics, but also in literature. So when I went to high school, I went to not a very great high school, but there were half a dozen excellent teachers. My English teacher was brilliant. She had gone to Columbia University and studied with a great person there, and wound up, teaching in my high school, of all things. It's an amazingly brilliant woman in English. And so I got very deep understanding of that. But my mathematics teacher was great. I mean, one of the great things he did was point out, the equation e to the pi I plus 1 equals 0, as e pi I 1 and 0 in the same equation. Well, it turns out that I never forgot that. And there's a book I did on mathematics with Rafael Nunez, my colleague. And we went into that looking at the metaphorical structure behind it. Because with all of those things, it had to be metaphors linking them. And it turns out that the square root of -1 has a metaphorical structure. Believe it or not.
Wow.
Because think about what -1 does. -1 times a positive number, flips it over, makes it negative. Do it again, it flips it back. Makes it positive. -1 times -1 is +1. Why? Why is -1 times -1 equal to +1? Because -1 is a flip of 180 degrees. You do two of them, you come back to where you started. That is, there's a metaphorical structure to basic arithmetic.
That's right? Beautiful.
And we figured that out, And there's a lot. In the book, Where Mathematics Comes From, it's basically the metaphorical structure of mathematics.
Wow.
And the metaphorical structure of mathematics is beautiful. I mean, it is... in mathematics, I always loved mathematics, and I always liked both mathematics and poetry. And I saw them as the same love. And in fact, they are. The mathematics as metaphorical and beautiful metaphors. People think mathematics and poetry couldn't be more different, and they're not.
It's wonderful because I think that, learning through metaphor is it's a much more joyful way to learn as well. I was walking my son, who's 8, home from school the other day. And I was like, the way kids are like, what did you learn in school? He's like, can't remember. And I was like, try. And he said, oh, we did subtraction. And I was like, oh, tell me about subtraction. And I started throwing them out. And I said 0 minus 1. And he's like, -1? And I was like, yeah. And I said, think about it like the ground. The ground is 0, ground 0. And -1 is 1 underground and 2. And he got it. It just clicked with him because he could see it in his mind. And I wanted to get onto that because you say that Metaphor is pervasive in everyday life, not just in language, but in thought and action. Our conceptual system in terms of which we both think and act is fundamentally metaphorical in nature. And I wanted to see if I have this right, to see if our audience gets this as well, because this is a key point, because I understood it to mean that metaphors can be akin to mental models, and they influence our thought and therefore our action and therefore how we experience life.
And that negative number stuff is right. What multiplying by -1 flips something by 180 degrees, right? So what about the square root of -1? It flips things by 90 degrees, because if you do it twice, you get a flip by 180 degrees, right? Do it 4 times, you come back. Yeah. So it turns out that there's a reason why, if you do the I plane, why multiplying by square root of -1 is a flip of 90 degrees. There's a reason why that geometry fits the arithmetic.
Beautiful. It makes sense. If a kid knows that, they can learn easier, especially if they're neurodiverse and they see the world differently and they literally see it differently in their mind.
Well, it's something that can be taught early, and that's, my mother taught me that. My mother, who never got past grade school, my parents never made it to high school.
Wonderful.
Right? Very, really smart, interesting people who just had to go to work when they were 12 and 13. But my mother made sure I had an education, and so did my father. Very, very smart people who just never had a chance. They had to go to work early. And there's a lot of that, a lot of people who are just very smart, and they need to be educated, and can be. And education is so vitally important. If you're going to spend money in a society on anything, start with education.
Yeah, changes how people interact with the world. But I wanted to bring it back to something you said. You mentioned about your wife and the art and your own experience in seeing through different disciplines, because there's a lot of, I'm going to call it, espoused neurodiversity out there, where organizations are saying, yes, we strive for diversity of thought in our organizations, but it's not always exactly the case. But one of the things you talked about in one of your books was, and this goes to what you were saying about the colors. So to me, that's yellow, but I don't know what the term of yellow you used that your wife... Ochre. So I didn't even know that color, right? And you talk about that actually, even from a male-female perspective, man-woman perspective, we see colors differently. And this is interesting because my other son, who's now 11, he said to me, Dad, you're listening. So I drop him to school when I can, and we listen to music on the way to school, and it's just a lovely calming. It's a great moment for me every morning. But he said one day, he goes, imagine we hear the music differently. And I said, we do. Everybody hears it differently. And I think that's just a beautiful way to think. And we see colors differently. We experience things differently, but we assume we don't.
Well, it's really true. And especially with color. I mean, we have men and women just are different in crucial ways for seeing color. I mean, and women will see color differently, and there are some women who see a million more shades of color. My wife probably does. They're called tetrachromates, but anyway, women and men see color differently because of genetic makeup, and people don't realize that makeup can be that different, can lead to a color difference, to a seeing difference. Because what's interesting about this is color is not there in the world. There are no colors that are objectively out there in the world. Color is created by your body. You know, there are wavelengths in the world, right? But no colors. But you see the world as colored.
And how does that happen in the brain then, George, and why?
Well, because we are physical beings, because of the way that our eyes are set up, connected to our brains. That produces an experience of color, and it's slightly different for men and women. And so we experience the world as if the colors were out there in the world, and they're not. They're not. There are wavelengths of light out there, and multiple wavelengths of light. So, anything in the world is going to reflect some sort of light, right? And that you can have complex reflections, but they're wavelengths, right? There are no colors in the world. We see the world as having colors because of the way our brains and eyes and bodies are set up. And here I am. I'm looking out. I look over San Francisco Bay. It's beautiful, blue. It's sort of gray above the sky, a little bit light above the mountains, some green in the mountains, green trees, and so on. I see the world as colored, but those are not there. They're wavelengths.
I read before that birds, for example, see a multitude versions of green because they need to understand foliage. But also then I thought this was interesting from artificial intelligence because they're training artificial intelligence to pick coffee beans. But they need the artificial intelligence. It's not just green. They have to know all the different types of green to understand the ripeness of the different things as well. So that probably maps a little bit to what you're saying there as well.
I had a friend who actually studied what birds saw. They have many dimensions of color that we don't have. And he found experimental ways to study that.
Share a little bit of that, man. That'd be amazing.
Well, there are like two whole dimensions of color that birds have that we don't have.
Because they've got an extra bit of oil or something in their...
Well, no, their brains are set up in a different way. They also have certain metals, in their brains. We all have iron and stuff around, and they have whatever it is they have. He had figured out what they had, and he pointed out they had like two dimensions of color that we don't have.
We had the brilliant Ian McGilchrist on the show before, and he was telling us he has a brilliant book on the divided brain and how the brain constructs the world, and it's polar opposites and all this kind of thing, and contrast, something that you talk about as well. But he said something that was fascinating to me about pigeons, that when a pigeon you see a pigeon, they look at you out one side of their eye because they have one side that's for focusing and like, say for example, they're trying to decipher a piece of grain in a load of stone on the ground. They will use one side of the brain and then they have to turn the other side to see the bigger picture. And it's like right and left brain because they don't have the evolutionary capacity that we have for the brain to be looking through both eyes at the same time to experience the world differently. I found that fascinating. Just you sparked that to memory right now.
There are actually studies of people that show that if you look at one eye versus the other eye, there are certain things you will see differently.
Oh.
Yeah, because what's in one eye is going on in the opposite part of the brain. They go across, and that's been studied by some folks at Berkeley about 20 years ago, and it turns out that the two hemispheres that we have see differently.
It's fascinating.
And also, there's an experiment because the left hemisphere has more for language. And it turns out that if you have a word for a color, your left hemisphere is going to see the color and pick it out differently and be able to distinguish one color from another better. So if you have a bunch of slides that sort of slowly go from one color to the next, like in a rainbow, right? and it's slow. The question is, where do you pick out the differences?
Yeah.
That was studied. It turns out that if you have a word for the color, your left brain is going to pick out a boundary in a different place than your right brain.
It's amazing. You've seen a lot of different layers on top of each other. Let's bring that back to when you were saying about, even the color and seeing things differently, the importance of neurodiversity in organizations. So one of the kind of driving forces behind this show is helping those people who work in change initiatives to drive change. And we're seeing in some ways a changing of the guard from an old style of leadership, an autocratic one, to a more democratic one. And I wanted to just get your thoughts on that. If you think about politics, your work on politics, and you go, how is that applicable to an organization or a leader in an organization driving change? Maybe it's a new business model they need to introduce, etc.
When I was 7 years old, my father gave me a 2-sentence account of democracy, which is, you're not better than anybody else and nobody else is better than you. Right? That
Period.
is, period. Something a 7-year-old can understand, but it really gets to the heart of the matter. This is not a matter of one person being better than another person. That's the heart, and that has to do with empathy, with caring about other people. That's never really discussed. Democracy is based on empathy. It's based on caring about other people. And in fact, a lot of our political disputes have to do with people who do and don't have empathy. There are a lot of Donald Trump has no empathy for anybody else. None. And people who see the world his way have no empathy. That's something that came out in a Bob Woodward interview, a series of interviews. But no, there's no empathy for anybody else. And and if you don't, you can understand why he would have that worldview.
Yeah.
There was this point at which they were at a graveyard for people who were killed in World War II, and Trump said they're suckers. Just
psychopathic stuff.
Yeah. A different kind of brain.
Yeah. I think that's important to understand as well. And unfortunately, the way the world has been structured is a lot of psychopaths. I've read once that 1% of the population is psychopathic. They have no empathy. Half of that percentage, 0.5%, are in prison, and the other half run organizations.
Yes, exactly.
Or countries. Yeah. Yeah, and it's just it's a shame. I really, really hope in my heart that that's changing. It's gradually changing, and it's one of the reasons I love doing the show and just sharing different thinking and hopefully introducing new frames.
By introducing new frames, this is a very important one. The idea that democracy is based on empathy is not out there, and it needs to be. And it really explains a lot of difference between the political parties in this country. Democrats largely are people who have empathy, and Republicans are largely people who don't. And a lot of the political differences and the arguments and the great anger that you get in politics has to do with whether or not people have empathy. It's something that is never discussed. It's amazing. It's just like, we give the name, Democrat, Republican. This is a partisan difference. They're in different parties. Well, there's a reason for the way those parties are structured, having to do with the way people think. That is never discussed in any of the shows on, you turn on the TV, you have politics all the time, no discussion about the difference in empathy, which is fundamental to our politics. And, and no discussion about how it affects discussions that are made politically. And, there's a word I made up for this situation. It's called hypocognition, the lack of ideas we need.
Yeah.
The idea that democracy is based on empathy is an idea we need, and it isn't out there in ordinary discourse.
It's a real shame, and one of the biggest requests I have on this show is to make it shorter, believe it or not. Do less because of attention spans, etc. And I won't cede, because I don't care about having extra listeners to shorten the show, because you can't dig deep enough into things. And to use the container metaphor again, but one of the things I did want to go a bit deeper in is you've raised it there. I did think about this. I looked at through the multiple lenses you gifted me with through reading your work and listening to the many lectures on YouTube. And the one that jumped to me was the political landscape, the left and right brain, the lack of empathy. But then you hit me with the sucker punch, which was that argument is war metaphor. Because that container of argument is war actually is a huge problem. And I'm going to help our audience here, and I'm going to just call out some of these. This will just make sense to you. And then George, perhaps you'll deconstruct it. Your claims are indefensible. He attacked every weak point in my argument. His criticisms are right on target. I demolished her argument. I've never won an argument with her. You disagree? Okay, shoot. It's all language of war.
That's how it is. And it's very sad. It's very important, to get beyond that argument is war. And to understand that it's there, and and to not fight, to say, okay, what do we mean by an argument? What you're doing is you have different views of the world, either worldviews, general worldviews, or views of certain topics, and you differ on those. You have different opinions about them, held very strongly. Okay. Well, what do you make of that? How do you live with people who have different opinions of these things? And you need to have some notion of mutual respect, to say, and to understand that they're not bad, they're different. There's a difference, and people who have different politics are not necessarily bad people. They may do bad things that you consider immoral in certain respects, but they also they have families and love their children, and are kind to people who are their neighbors and so on. You have to sort of remember that all the time.
And I loved your alternative, and this is just beautiful. And I'm going to share this with our audience. So, argument's not a war, but it could be conceptualized as a dance. The participants are seen as performers, and the goal is to perform in a balanced and aesthetically pleasing way. And you say, in such a culture, people would view arguments differently, experience them differently, carry them out differently, and talk about them differently. But we would probably not view them as arguing at all. They would simply be doing something different. And that is just such a wonderful alternative.
And people have strong feelings about this, but they also have strong feelings about what kind of dance they like. Do you like ballet, or do you like modern dance, or this,
Yeah.
whatever? Uh,
That helped as well, because I thought about that when you introduced this concept, and I was like, going, okay, well, George may be a great tango master, and I'm salsa, but we agree that first and kind of go, how do you dance, George? And you go, I'm a tango guy, and I go, okay, well, I'll try. I'm a salsa guy, but I might step on your toes a few times, and then we agree, and it just changes the conversation. It changes. It's no longer an argument. It's a dance.
and it's see, the question is, how are you, quote, invested in this argument? And do you have a moral basis for this? If so, well, what is your understanding of morality? Where does this come from? um and you have arguments all the time. You have differences of opinion all the time, and it's not always obvious where they come from and what the consequences of them are. It's and not only that, it's hard when it's about something you care about, step back and say, wait a minute, someone else cares very much about something that's at odds with this. Why is that happening? What can you do about it? What do you make of it? It's hard to do because it's so emotional.
So, George, I'd love to introduce another one, and I highly recommend the book because it's got so many here, and we're only like on chapter 2, George, by the way, and there's 30 chapters. They're short and they're snackable as well, so you can read one each and let it sink in, let it marinate. But I'm just full of the metaphors, George. Sorry about that. I'll dig into this one because the idea of how metaphorical expressions in everyday language can structure our everyday activities. And to do this, you tell us to consider the metaphorical concept, time is money. And this one just absolutely jumped out to me because if we think about this, and I'd let you expand on it, it has absolutely structured how society is built, how society is constructed mentally in our frames.
When I first wrote that, a friend of mine read it. He's a very literal-minded person. And he said, what do you mean it's a metaphor? It's true. If I hire somebody and it takes more time, I have to pay him more money. Yeah. And I said, that's the point.
You're like, boom, mic drop.
He says, it's not metaphorical, it's true. And I said, yes, metaphors can actually structure your life. We live by them and they become true. And he just couldn't get this. I mean, the very idea that a metaphor could structure his life and become true, it was not something he could comprehend.
I'll just give our audience a couple of ones here. So, you're wasting my time. This gadget will save you hours. I don't have time to give you. How do you spend your time these days? The flat tire cost me an hour. So it's built into all our language. And the list goes on and on and on. But I wanted to jump to further parts here because we're not going to have time to get through everything. But I wanted to really share this one, structural schemas, George, because here I'm going to ask our audience to just think about 2 sentences that I'm going to read out, and then perhaps, George, you'll share what's going on here. The first is, the road runs through a forest. And the second, very similar but very different in the brain, the road meanders through the forest. So let's let them seep in, and then you share what's gone on there for all of us in our brains, our synapses, our neurons firing. What's going on?
Those sentences came up from a brilliant linguist named Leonard Talmy, who has studied not just those cases, but lots of other cases relating to those. And the idea is that you think about the role that lines, things that are linear like a road, can be seen as traveling along it. So there's a metaphorical understanding of something that is a line of motion. A line can be understood as a line of motion, as a path of motion. And Leonard Talmy figured that out. And he said, look, if it's path of motion, there are lots of kinds of motion. Fast motion, slow motion, motion where you're paying close attention, motion where you're not, etc. And he found all these sentences that show these differences. So the road meanders through the valley. What does that mean? You think about it, if you're traveling around the road, you're not just trying to get somewhere fast as possible. You're looking, at what's nice around there. You're looking at the scenery, etc. And you're doing it in a way that you're thinking slowly and paying attention to the scenery. Whereas runs through the valley, you're thinking of getting from one end to the other, right? So your understanding of what's going on as you traverse that road is different. And that's what Len Talmy noticed. Very smart guy.
Yeah. And I said to you, you're so generous with your sharing of the knowledge of so many of your colleagues and your fellow change makers.
I have the great good fortune of living in Berkeley, California, and being at the University of California with an amazing number of incredible people and colleagues and students, and just great luck.
You make your luck, my friend. I'm going to keep going here because there was one thing that really, really is so valuable for those CEOs, those leaders, those innovators, those heads of change who listen to the show. And it's that a single sentence will mean different things to different people. So think back to what George was mentioning about the colors and how we all see colors differently, etc. And how we hear a sentence depends on our context. And here's an example you give us. You say, we need new alternative sources of energy. Very apt in the days that we're in, considering the book was written in 1980. And this means something very different to the president of Mobil Oil from what it means to the president of Friends of the Earth. I'd love you to expand on this because this is a key point in communication.
So the idea of sources of energy have to do with what you believe should be sources of energy, what they legitimately are and what they ideally ought to be, especially when you're talking about new ones. So when you say new ones, means new relative to your values. It's not just new objectively, because you're understanding the world through different value systems. So if you're, in Friends of the Earth, you have an environmental value system. If you're the president of Mobil Oil, you have, a different value system. You're making money off of oil and gas, right? And you see the world through your value systems. You don't just, and it's not just hearing the sentence, it's understanding the world. You understand the world through value systems. And, that happens all over the place. And those value systems are taken for granted. In some cases, they're obvious and people know that there are these different value systems. In many cases, they're not obvious. And people have arguments where the value systems are kind of hidden, not obvious. And, it's important to see what value systems lie behind what you're saying and what you believe and what you disbelieve and what you would argue against.
And George, one final one. We're not going to have much time, but so what I'm trying to do here with all this is to go, like you say, understand how you think, how your thoughts are built, how the language you use is so important. One of the things, for example, I realized is I do a lot of speaking events, etc. And I never use the word argument. I never go, my argument is. I'll use stuff like my opinion or my thesis. because I think the argument's it's an aggressive word.
You're using the argument as war metaphor
Yeah.
if you're doing that. Now, now there are times when you want to use it. There are times when you say, hey, there's some bad guys out there, and I have an argument against, notice the word against them, right? And, so there are times when it's appropriate. Other times when when you're saying what you believe, period, and you're not arguing against people, and you don't say, I have good values and they have values that I think are terrible. Right? When in that case, you're arguing against.
So something you talked about was contrasts, that the brain loves contrasts. So that would match what you're saying there. Like, I want to express the contrast. I'm arguing against them because they're bad and I'm good, and I want that to come across in a container of thought.
You want to distinguish them. That means have a line and spatially say, where some people over there, I'm over here. And then what is that distinction? You're metaphorically spatializing these things and putting them in different in different parts of the world.
It's so important. I just think your work is so important for, like, it should be essential reading in politics class if there's a politician school. It's so important. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was your cascade of metaphors, because this theory of cascades is so important. And a wonderful and very relevant example that you give is Ben Bernanke's fiscal cliff.
Yeah, it was very, very interesting thing to see. How you could possibly understand going off the fiscal cliff, right? Right. So first you have to understand the economy as moving from the past to the future along a path. So if you look at graphs of the economy, they will go left to right. Left is former, right is future relative to that. And they'll go up or down and so on, right? Now, when your graph of the economy is going up, that's a quote, a good thing. Good is up, bad is down. And that means more people are earning more money, which is a good thing. They have more money to spend, there's more economic activity, etc. And when the economy is down, it means people have less money to spend and engage in economic activity, right? So what is the fiscal cliff? It's a disaster. It means people are going to have so much less money, they're not going to be able to get much. Their lives are going to be much worse, etc. Okay? And it means bad is down, good is up. The past is on the left, the future is on the right, right? So you're structuring this thing metaphorically, but you're saying something that is important economically.
And you can see why that really resonated with people, because they just got it. And I think that's one of the things that
if you go off the cliff, you get hurt. Disaster, you get killed.
So I want one thing that I think is so hyper important to share before we finish up is, you tell us that the same part of your brain that we use to do something is also the same part of the brain we use to imagine it. And this is vital for rehearsal, if it's piano, if it's shooting hoops, like your friend that you grew up with perhaps. And you tell us also this is the case for language, reading and learning. There's a lot in there because it involves, back to empathy, etc., the work on mirror neurons and canonical neurons as well.
Well, in order to, when you're thinking about stuff, you're using the metaphor that action is motion. Very basic action. So that acting is moving. Achieving a purpose is getting to a location. Starting an action is being at a place where you haven't started to move yet. Action is motion. Achieving a purpose is getting to a desired destination, right? That metaphor for acting is everywhere, right? So you can't not think about purposeful action without using that metaphor. And there's no way you can't think about it at all. No purposeful action can be thought about without that metaphor. And it's important to understand that purposeful action is always going to be understood in terms of metaphors of that sort. That having purposes is going to metaphorically move you to act according to that metaphor. Now, that may or may not be a good thing. And it's hard to get out of the metaphor. Very hard to get out of the metaphor and say, wait a minute, what is my purpose? Do I have a purpose here? Am I understanding purpose in terms of this metaphor? What is implied by understanding it that way? Now there are different metaphors for purposes. You can have one metaphor for purposes is reaching a destination. Another one is getting a desired object. So you can, and when you put them together, you can get somewhere. When both metaphors are there at once. If I got to Chicago. Why can you say get? Achieving a purpose is getting a desired object, and it's getting to a certain purpose, to a certain location. You put those two metaphors together, and you can get to Chicago. Right? So, but you might be using one of them and not another. And so the question is, are your actions and the way you structure your life and your desires and what your future is, does that involve one or another of these two very different metaphors?
Yeah.
Now that could mean that you should live your purposeful life in terms of acquisition, getting property, getting money, etc., or in terms of the experience of moving somewhere, exploring the world, etc. Those are different modes of achievement in life. And you can use both of them, some of both, some of one, some of the other, etc. But it's important to understand the difference between them.
This is so useful for people who are struggling maybe with their lives and the journey they're on, that to understand, because you talk about this and you dedicate a lot of time to the idea that bigger is better, but it doesn't mean that it is. It's just ingrained in our culture. George, I wanted to ask you one last thing, because I think this one is so key. Firstly, the language we use in change and innovation becomes so core, especially if we're articulating it to people who are resistant to change, which is most of the world. But I think understanding ourselves is a step closer. Understanding ourselves is a step closer to understanding bias and understanding diversity and the importance of all those things. But there was one thing that I thought was so amazing, which is the whole idea of frames, because it's really interesting from an innovation and business model perspective. Because if we construct something, like you tell us, like a restaurant through a series of frames or image schemas, I thought then, what if we unbundle those frames and image schemas and start to remix them? Because then we'll create different schemas. And if that was me as an organization, we've seen this during COVID. Our idea of a restaurant was set, but then it was actually forced apart because those organizations had to change, and they had actually changed their businesses as a result. But I thought looking at that through image schemas and frames was an interesting perspective.
First, the idea of frames was invented, frame semantics, invented by my late colleague, Charles Fillmore, who saw frames just as a matter of linguistics. He just said, look, your meals of the day are framed as breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That's a frame, right? And so on. And he has lots and lots of examples of this, modes of transportation, etc. They're frames for all sorts of things. You structure your life in terms of your understanding in terms of frames. And frame structures are very simple structures. They're what are called Gestalt structures. Think of a single geometrically as a node with a number of other nodes that form a single image or Gestalt, right? And the nodes are alternatives, choosing one or another. That's all it is, right? But they're related. There are relationships between them. So they're different and they're related in certain ways, or they might be mutually exclusive. One may entail the other. There might be other relationships between them. So they're connected in that way. And that's what a frame is. And you structure all sorts of things in your life and politics and every area of life in terms of these frames. That's what Fillmore figured out. Now, Fillmore saw this as just a matter of linguistics. I looked at this and said, my God, our politics is set up that way. Our values in life are set up that way. Chuck Fillmore didn't want to think about it that way. He wanted to think about himself as just doing linguistics, not doing politics.
Swim lane, man.
Values in life, just doing. I study language, period. And I said, you can't do that. Your idea is so deep that it encompasses all this other stuff. And I have a book on framing. Don't think of an elephant, know your values, frame the debate. And that book will explain all this stuff about what frames are and how they work. And they're everywhere. And they're especially there in politics. They're extremely important in politics. For you can't set goals without framing things in one way or another. There's no way to do it. You have to frame things in one way or another. And you can't decide what you're going to be doing without framing things in one way or another. You can't set schedules without them, and so on. And it's important to recognize the structure of framing. So the book is Don't Think of an Elephant, Know Your Values, and Frame the Debate. And it's a cheap book, Chelsea Green Press. And but the guy who figured this out was Charles Fillmore, a great linguist.
I thought about the importance of that. Understand what a frame is in order to reframe it, in order to innovate. That's how you change things, by reframing them. So I thought it was so vitally important. With that in mind, I wanted to ask you one final question, and it is, what metaphors we live by today do you think are dangerous, and maybe we need to update them or retire them? What would be your message to our audience?
We need to understand that democracy requires empathy. And we don't have that. Right? It means caring about other people. And there are people who have no empathy. And they will see democracy as just being able to make whatever choices they want. So, but the whole idea that you have democracy doesn't make any sense without empathy, without caring about other people. That's why, you have all sorts of autocrats showing up on the right. You have right-wing autocrats who are, doing things that are not for other people, but for themselves. And it's important to understand that democracy is based on empathy. Autocracy doesn't have it. Right? That's why, autocrats are dangerous. So, and it's not said. You watch all the political TV shows you want on your favorite channel, and it'll never be said. But it needs to be. It's sort of it's sort of the basis of understanding democracy. So that's one thing I would say is really important.
And George, for people who want to find out more about your work, your books, Frame Labs, where can they find you?
Go to Google.
He's everywhere.
A lot of books, There Metaphors to Live By is a wonderful book, and I recommend it. And actually, it's been one of the 20 most cited books in all the social sciences ever.
Wow.
It's amazing. But it's been out there. A lot of people have read it. You can read it in a night. Bigger things like Philosophy in the Flesh are serious 600-page things. If you're interested in mathematics, Where Mathematics Comes From, which I wrote with Rafael Nunez, is a wonderful book on how mathematics is metaphorically structured. Why does mathematics work the way it does? People think mathematics is like objective out there in the world, etc. And the fact is, it's metaphorically understood fundamentally. A simple thing is a line, a sequence of points. That's a metaphor. Line doesn't have to be a sequence of points; just be a line. No? But it's a metaphor that's there in our normal mathematics. And they go through lots and lots of others. They're all over the place. To understand mathematics metaphorically, it makes the mathematics into poetry. And mathematics is beautiful. That's why it's beautiful. People who teach mathematics don't generally teach the beauty of it. I was fortunate. I had a high school math teacher who actually taught some of the beauty of it. I'm eternally grateful to that, to him. And I remember vividly his lecture on e to the pi I plus 1 equals 0. And I said, oh my God. And eventually we came to understand that we have a study of the metaphorical structure behind that equation in Where Mathematics Comes From. It took a lot of work to figure that out. And it's a beautiful thing. I mean, mathematics is so beautiful, so poetic.
I wish I had you as my maths teacher back in the day, man. I probably would have done a lot better. George, it's been an absolute pleasure and an honor, and I thank you for your time. You're so generous, and as I said, you've sparked so many neurons for me. I'm going to be going down rabbit holes for a very long time. And to use one last metaphor to thank you for all the gifts you have given society. It's been a great pleasure speaking to you, author of Metaphors We Live By, George Lakoff. Thank you.
I want to thank you, Aidan, because wonderful interviews like this are rare. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's a lovely gift. Thank you, man.